Mark Johnson with News from the Front. Been trying to figure out for about the last year and a half, where are we in this situation in the United States? What kind of situation is this? What's the model? What's the frame of reference? About a year and a half ago, when I saw the beginning of the presidential election and some of the things that I'd seen in the courts and so on, it seemed to me we were going into a period that was kind of like I couldn't decide if it was a civil war or if it was like the Revolutionary War. What was this? The idea that it's a war is a little bit of it's a loaded term. I don't know if we should use that term, but we certainly are in a period that is not unlike those periods. If you want to look at this as a institutional realignment, you could look at the Civil War as an institutional realignment. The South and the North, the way that the institution of slavery was upheld for all those many decades since the Revolution, and the situation in the country, the way the laws and the way the society had accepted slavery certainly had reached a point where it was untenable, unacceptable, and it needed to be dealt with. You could look at the Revolutionary period as much the same way. The relationship between the colonies and Britain was undergoing changes for many decades before the Revolutionary period, and yet over time it became more and more apparent that that relationship was stressed and strained and untenable under the situation that they were in, the cultural changes, the values, and essentially the idea that people should be free economically and politically and culturally. There was a lot of things that just were not sustainable in the Revolutionary period. In both of these circumstances, you had a hot war. You had people going onto the battlefield, shooting and killing and maiming, many people. Is this the kind of period we're in now? I don't believe it probably is. I think there's more something that you could compare, say, to what Russia went through with the collapse of the Soviet Union. I don't think there were a tremendous amount of bloodshed in that period. There might have been some, but it was nothing like World War II, and it was not a total internal chaos, a breakdown of society. So, our current system here, how has it changed, and what is it that's unsustainable? Since World War II, at least, and you could argue this going back to the beginning of the 20th century, the relationship between the government and the people underwent some changes. You certainly had a extreme realignment of things during a war like World War II. The economic base, the manufacturing base, the whole society, there were rationing and all kinds of things that had to be done. It was a national sacrifice, and everything was centered on the government's role and what the government would do. There was a lot of propaganda. There was a lot of sort of messaging that would try and get people to support the war, to support the nation, to support the idea that we were doing the right thing. It was a just cause, and so on. All of the institutions that in our society, the primary institutions, I would call them, whether it's the education system, whether it's the media, whether it's the government and political class, political system, all of these institutions underwent, I think, a sort of a major change, although people weren't conscious of the change in so many words. I think some were. But, you had the New Deal, and you had a huge amount of shift of power and dependency on the central government to do certain things. So in that period, there was a tremendous reliance and trust in these institutions. And much of that, I would say, looking back on it, from what I know in the history books, I wasn't really alive. Post-World War II, baby boom generation, my experience was what happened afterwards, but we really had I'd say, a reasonable amount of trust in our institutions, and it was not ill-founded entirely, although we were on a trajectory that was eventually going to lead to what we have now, I believe. Institutions and the situation with institutions in any society, I think, do undergo periodic changes. There's a book that Steve Bannon actually is quite interested in, and has gotten quite involved in sort of talking about, I think, in some context. It's called The Fourth Turning, William Strauss and Neil Howe. And I think it really talks about how institutions and how societies undergo these periodic changes. I'm not a big fan of these kind of algorithms that define how societies are going to change or how things change according to some formula, but I think in general there's probably something to it, and certainly we've seen examples of this. You look at the Soviet Union, the collapse after 70 or so some odd years. You had the Civil War, which was 70 or so odd years after the Revolutionary War. So here we are, 70 or 80 years after World War II. It's not unreasonable to say that we would see problems or issues related to the way these institutions have evolved. My argument would be that all of these things have undergone a sort of atrophy. There's become a kind of a power base, so there's an established class of people who have a vested interest in the status quo and in the power of the institutions of which they're a part. There's been at some point when you have power in any form, there will be abuse of that power. I think that there has been an abuse of power in all of these institutions, the media, the education system, government, and others. And so, we've gotten to a point now, I think, where we are seeing, a need to change that relationship to fix the problem. The issue is, how can you change something that is so ingrained, so embedded in your whole society and in your culture? And to do something like this is something akin to war. War is, like I say, a loaded term. It conjures up, especially with the Civil War, you think about things like Gettysburg or Bull Run, or the Revolutionary War, Yorktown and Saratoga. And I'm not saying that violence is inevitable, but we are in a point where there is a certain conflict and a clash of values and of viewpoints, and you have a very strongly entrenched power class of people in these institutions, and they don't want to give up their positions, and so you are going to see a very stark, a very difficult battle, and we are undergoing that now, in my opinion. As far as what we're experiencing, we're seeing a whole bunch of different, it's extremely complex. The Revolutionary War, there was a lot of complex factors, and even the Civil War. And now you have kind of the same thing. In the Revolutionary period, some of the factions you had that were in conflict at various times, you had the Patriots, the Radicals they were called at the time, people that were involved in propaganda and radical activism, people like Patrick Henry and others that were sort of pushing for change. You had the merchant class, you had the plantation owners, you had the small farmers, agrarian class, you had oligarchs, people that were involved with the colonial governments and involved with the political aspect of the colonial governments. And then you had the sort of the Tories or the British loyalists, the people that didn't want change. And I think today you see kind of comparable things. We have a large group of people that are sort of non-political, and they're not really affiliated strongly with a ideology of any particular kind. They might be considered moderates in some ways, and generally these kinds of people are just basically fearful of change, and they just want the status quo. They don't want to undergo any kind of major dislocation that would they fear that kind of situation. On the left, you have different ideologies there. You have the Marxist socialists that are mainly, Fabian socialism, they call it. It's mainly a sort of passive approach to transforming society towards a more socialist type of government. And I would kind of look at traditionally the Democrat Party, and a lot of the people that have been on the left in the last 100 years, I would say have been Fabian socialists. You also have the Marxist-Stalinskyites. These are the ones that are out to manipulate and revolutionize society in some kind of radical way, some kind of disruptive way. And then you have people that are into it for just despotic power. So they may be Marxist or socialist in general, but they're really just in it for the power. So, I'd say people like, Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton. Barack Obama would probably be in the Marxist-Stalinskite category. Hillary Clinton is more in the more just pure despotic power, socialist power. And Bernie Sanders would be more of a Marxist socialist, a Fabian socialist. He does want a collectivist type of society, but he's more of a utopian. He's not into just the power aspect of it. On the right, you have a bunch of divisions there. You have people that want to restore sort of religious cultural ethic that has been lost in the past 100 years. You have people that are single issues, people that are focus only on things like abortion or maybe gay marriage or whatever it may be. There's just issues that people just focus on those things. And then you have what are often called conservatives or constitutional conservatives, and they just want to restore the republic under the original concept of the founding, and so liberty under the founding principles. And those are people like Ted Cruz, and I'm trying to think of some of the people in the Liberty Caucus in the House and in the Senate, Mike Lee, and so on. And then you have people that, even on the right and the left, but especially on the right, that are maybe Republican or conservative in their ostensible ideology and beliefs, but it's really a pretense. They really fall into this more of a moderation or a status quo basis. And just like all of the other institutions, they don't want to change in the institutional structure. They like what it is now. They benefit from it. They have power of place and standing in the current structure. And I would say Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan and Mike McCarthy, a lot of the people, and probably a majority of the people in our elected officials, and both at the state level and the national level, more than not, probably more like 70 or 80% at least fall into that category. And then you have these movements of people that are, sort of following these ideologies. You have sort of, I would call it, even though it's a pejorative term, there's kind of mobs and mob leaders at this point, where you have people pushing for change, or pushing for the status quo, or pushing for the continuance of this sort of left-wing or democratic socialist kind of order. And so you have a lot of things in this area that would be called propaganda. I think that one of the first things that I wanted to sort of talk about in this realm is, these are just sort of a series of questions up on the screen here, but we talk about propaganda. Is that ruling the situation now? Is all of the rhetoric and the polemics we see, is it really valid, or is it really just manipulation? And I think there's truth to that position. I think there's a lot of rhetoric and manipulation going on in all forms of media, whether it's the new media, social media. You have a mob mentality in the social media in particular. They talk about the echo chamber, the people that are out to just, foment kind of discontent and get people that agree with them, and they just want to deal with people that agree with them. So there isn't any real dialogue going on. During the Revolutionary period, you had the same kind of things happening. I think people generally don't like change. People don't want to do things unless they have to do things. And so during the Revolutionary War, you had a long period or a relatively long period where people just, they didn't like what was happening. They had issues with some of the taxation and some of the control, some of the things that the British were doing, but there wasn't enough, sort of emotional drive behind these things to initiate change. And yet, the things that were happening were important. They were abstract. People won't fight for abstract principles. You talk about the idea of liberty. I think it's been said, people won't fight for the concept of liberty. They might fight for food or for the, right to, have certain civil rights established for them or whatever, but if they've been taken away. But in general, the idea of liberty, individual liberty, natural law, natural rights, these things are too abstract. And yet, the founding generation, there were people that recognized that these principles were important because they had an impact on everyday life. So the kind of government you have, the kinds of principles upon which governments are based, and the kind of role and relationship between governments and society, these things actually have real consequences in terms of our freedoms. So you had propagandists then. You had Patrick Henry, Thomas Paine, Sam Adams, Paul Revere, and others who dominated the press. At that time it was newspapers and broadsides and things like this. And you had a lot of people that were out trying to, get people motivated, get people concerned, and you certainly would call that propaganda, but it was propaganda based on principles that they truly believed in. And certainly we have this now. On the left, you have people pushing for social justice and what they term as social justice. They still believe in a collectivist, Marxist, socialist kind of ideology, which in my opinion has failed, and it's going to lead to some kind of totalitarian control, to failure. Government, too much power, and government is going to fail society, and actually the things that people on the left that they think they want, they're actually not going to have, and they'll actually be, it'll be a disaster if they actually get what they want or what they think they want. On the right, you have a whole bunch of different views and people that are propagandizing those views. So on the left, you have people like Chuck Schumer, Elijah Cummings, Barack Obama. You have the Hollywood class, the actors and entertainers. You have left-wing groups of various kinds, spokesmen of these groups. These are all out on the media every day propagandizing for their point of view. And the average person looks at this stuff and they don't quite know what's being done to them. They sense and they have an idea that they're being manipulated or that people are trying to manipulate them, but it's not, the distinction between the principles themselves and this propaganda is not always clear to a lot of people. On the right, you have the same kinds of things. You have the media personalities, Rush Limbaugh, Mark Levin, Sean Hannity, even Donald Trump himself, Ted Cruz, and then even people like Daniel Horowitz, who talks about the judicial tyranny, judicial activism, and how this has been it has compromised the independence of the judiciary and created a sort of despotism even now as we speak. And so all these things are actually happening. So even though there is propaganda, it's propaganda based on certain principles. The situation, as I see it, it has become we're leading towards a sort of untenable clash of these two systems and these two groups, although the sides have not been totally chosen up yet, and it's not clear that we're going to have a clear distinction between which side is for what, because there's a lot of different factions. But it increasingly seems like a zero-sum game. If you're in the institutions that are threatened at this point, whether it's the media, whether it's the judiciary, whether it's the elected officials of government, whether it's academia, these people have a very strong vested interest in maintaining what's going on now, and they will use every means at their disposal to retain their position. On the other hand, the people that are fed up with the system and with the like I say, the kinds of characteristics that these institutions have taken on are sort of awake and much more concerned about things and where things will go. again, it's kind of based on principles, but it's also based on what's going to happen if it continues like it is and if it gets worse. And I think there's a serious concern on their part that it is leading us towards a much more despotic type of arrangement where media is completely controlled, where government is essentially not answerable to the people, and where you have, the balance of power has been compromised, and so you have the administrative state of the executive branch basically unelected and being able to exercise great control over society. You have the judiciary that has been able to accumulate power that was never meant for it under the founding of the country. And so you essentially have a supreme judiciary, not just a judicial review, but actually judicial supremacy. And so in effect, the Supreme Court and the various other courts in the judicial system are in effect legislating, and they're actually creating laws by the precedents and the things they do. So this is a huge issue. These issues are not trivial, and it seems like there's no simple, easy way to resolve them. People are you see this concern about a civil war, which we keep hearing things. Some of the more vocal advocates talk about this. You see the left groups, some of the groups that may be supported by or funded by people that are not as visible, like George Soros or even other people. A lot of different front groups of various kinds, whether it's the CARE or it's various the Southern Poverty Law Center. A lot of these left-wing groups are organized and focused and cooperating, or kind of have a relationship with each other to try and push forward more of a transformational socialist kind of agenda. And these people are out there pushing and even causing certain kinds of demonstrations and violence in the streets. So far on the right, you haven't seen that kind of violence yet. It doesn't mean it won't happen. That's a concern, is that if you get to a point where there is no way to get to the entities that are creating these problems or obstructing positive change, then you have a possible threat of violence. I'm not promoting violence. I think there's nothing good that can come from violence necessarily. You could look back on even the Civil War and say, there should have been a better way than to sacrifice 600,000 or 700,000 lives to try and reform our society and our relationship and this slavery, the institution of slavery. But sometimes these things happen, and there doesn't seem to be any insight or ability of society to work it out. The same thing with the Revolutionary period. There was a resistance to, even a denial of the idea that you would ever have to go to war with Britain. They kept thinking that you would have some kind of representative government, you would have some kind of compromise that would deal with these issues so that you would not require any kind of a real war. It was almost unthinkable that there would be a war. And yet at the end of the day, there just wasn't any way to, whether it was a lack of imagination or a lack of willingness, it was too big of a change. It was a threat. It was seen as a threat to the whole theory of empire under the British system, and so there just wasn't any other way than to actually come to physical violence. I don't know where this is going. I don't think anybody knows. I think if you look back at these other periods, the Civil War, prior to the Civil War, it was leading towards a war, but most people thought if it was, it would be short. It would be, certain, things would happen that would be able to be resolved quickly, even if there was some level of violence. I don't think anybody anticipated, and certainly the nation overall was shocked at the amount of death and destruction that was caused and how long it went on. The Revolutionary War was the same way. People did not want to accept that it would be a war, but with their mother country, and yet that's what happened. Again, I'm not saying that's what's going to happen now, but it's certainly not beyond the realm of possibility that these things could eventually happen. I think what we have is right now is a continuing pressure cooker. There is no way to resolve the problem, and so you saw this. This was the Boston Tea Party. So the way the British had ended up with the East India Company, and they had changed the fees or duties on East India products, and basically those products were shipped directly to the colonies, and there wasn't anybody they could get at to change this. And so the merchant class in particular thought that this was essentially destroying their business, their livelihood, and forcing them to do something, making them dependent on England. And so there was a rejection of this, and it was looked at as a ploy or as a strategy to gain control over the colonies, and people at that point were just not willing to accede to it. So without going into that, I think that's the kind of thing where you have, eventually it builds up. And so once the Boston Tea Party happened, of course, the British government said, this is outrageous. You shouldn't be, doing these kinds of things for no cause. We're giving you products that you use. They're cheaper than even what you pay now. And so when they did this, the Boston Tea Party and some of the violence that happened after that, then the British came in and said, well, we're going to close down the Boston port. We're just going to ruin your whole economy in Boston and New England, and see what you think of that. So it was a sort of radical step by the British government. And at that point, you saw the fuse lit for Lexington and for other things that were going to happen later until the war actually happened. So we do see these things building up. It's sort of a, irresistible force against an immovable object, and I don't know where it's going to lead. There's still quite a bit of division between various factions, as I mentioned. So there's chaos. We are seeing, sort of chaotic kinds of things happening, certain things happening in the political realm, things happening on the streets where there are demonstrations and some violence, some destruction happening there. But we haven't seen a sort of a unity between the two sides yet, and so we could see something that would break, where you would see a shift towards one side or the other. Personally, I would think that we would see a shift towards a restoration of the republic and constitutional order. I think that's where we should be. That's part of our founding. That's part of it's in our DNA. But so far, I haven't seen that. We have it's almost like a blood feud or a fight to the death with the media. You have, institutional, groups of people, whether it's the teachers' unions or it's the, university systems or whatever it may be, the, executive, the administrative state. And these people they're going to go to fight to the bitter end. And I don't know what's going to give. So we see this building pressure every time we had the executive order that Trump gave for the suspension of people coming in from the 7 countries in the Middle East. These are countries that don't have any a way to track their own people. There's no system there, and so you can't vet people properly. You can't know who they are. You can't really be confident that they're not, part of them won't be, terrorist activists, people that are going to try and come in and do damage to the country. And so there's and then this was overridden essentially in a almost really a lawless manner by a judge in Washington. The Ninth Circuit basically put an injunction against the implementation of the executive order. Most people that know the law, say this was unconstitutional. It was unjustified completely. And so you have a judiciary that's dominated by people that come out of the elite law schools who have a certain ideology. Most of it is left of center by far. And so there is, again, sort of an, immovable situation or an unresolvable situation. And so in that case, you had a temporary victory. and then you had a tremendous amount of anger and frustration and outrage on the other side. And on the other hand, if you see something that, where maybe Trump is implementing more enforcing the immigration laws, starting to deport some of these criminal, illegal aliens, and other things that he may do to fulfill some of his campaign promises, then you're going to see victory sort of on his side. So the other side will be outraged and protest, and you may have violence on that side and so on. So we don't seem to have any way to, there's no pressure relief on the situation. Again, it doesn't seem right now there's any common ground at all. So there's no win-win situation. You can't really negotiate on either side. There is no margin for compromise or for coming up with something. I think most of the people on the right side of the spectrum look at what's happened in the last 80 years has been a long series of compromises that have gotten us to this situation, and significant change has to happen. And on the other side is they're willing to sort of pretend they're going to compromise, but they don't give an inch. And so you really have two uncompromising situations there with no ability to moderate it. It's also interesting that this is affecting not just the United States, it's affecting Western society in general, especially Europe. We see the same things happening with the European Union and the British Brexit. We see a lot of issues in France and in Germany and in Sweden and some of the other countries dealing with the immigration issue. That's dividing those populations. And then you have just generally the idea of a supranational or state or supranational national governance coming from things like the United Nations, coming from World Trade Organization kinds of things where they're aggregating and supervening national authority or national sovereignty. And so there's just a lot of things going on in the West generally. So it's interesting to see that happening as well. In effect, the radical side, the Democrat Party, has been taken over by a radical element of the left. I would say, Barack Obama's statement that he wanted to completely transform American society was sort of indicative, a code for revolution. Most of the Communist Party, ideology and strategy throughout the 20th century was based on a revolution of some kind. You had the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and you've had communist revolutions in many countries throughout the 20th century. So the idea that you would revolutionize or fundamentally change the country is definitely the dominant ideology in the Democrat Party. I don't see that moderating. So there again, you have such a radical stance with people like Keith Ellison and some of the other people that are leading the Democrat Party. There doesn't seem to be any moderation in there, and there's not any common ground that can be found. So that's what I think at this point. I don't know where this is going. We hope it doesn't lead to violence. My hope is that we will see something break in the situation in the next several months, but it's hard to say. So we'll be monitoring this and hoping that we don't end up in anything like a civil war, that will end up with something where people will start to, the average person, the grassroots, the general citizens of the country will start to realize that there's going to be a need to educate people and to get people more aware of these things. And this happened in the Revolutionary War as well. I don't think a lot of people understood the principles and the ideas, these abstract ideas, but over time they did. And you saw more and more as states or the colonies attempted to develop their own constitutions, and some of the mistakes they made, some of the lessons they learned were applied in the Articles of Confederation and later in the Constitutional Convention in 1787. So there will be a need for education. The question really is whether the mob mentality, the propaganda, and we are getting inundated in a way that's unprecedented, I would say, from so many various ways that it's a question of whether we'll be able to, whether calmer heads will prevail. My inclination is to say they will, but we have a very stark contrast between the two camps on the left and the right, and there's no clear way that I see right now to resolve it, so something will have to change. Well, that's it for now. Until next time.